It's the Sheena Metal Experience right here on LA Talk Radio. For more info on the show, latalkradio.com, SheenaMetalExperience.com. Don't forget to email me and let me know what you think of the show. My next guest is making his debut here on the Sheena Metal Experience. He's a very, very talented author, and his new book, Funny the Book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy, is out right now, and he's going to be appearing at the West Hollywood Book Fair and also at the California Women's Conference. Please welcome to the Sheena Metal Experience, the wonderful David Misch is here. David, it's so great to have you here. Thanks for being here with me.
My pleasure.
So tell me a little bit about you before Funny the Book. Where did you grow up in the country, and what was sort of your introduction to the arts?
Oh, well, I grew up in the suburb of Chicago, and my parents had all sorts of music and the comedy, I guess, playing around the house, and we watched TV together and read lots of books. I was a big reader, and in the comedy world, I got interested in Robert Benchley and James Thurber at a very young age, and would read them after lights out, under the covers, and things like that. So it's pretty much my whole life I've been interested in comedy and other art forms as well.
Interesting. So comedy was something that at a young age really kind of stood out with you.
Yeah, I always knew I wanted to be a writer from age 7. In fact, my most prolific year was age 7. I wrote like 30 books. A book at that time, I believe, consisted of 15 pages, at least in my house. But I wrote all the time and knew that was what I wanted, and I was lucky enough to actually do it.
It's wonderful. And you were always writing funny stuff.
There was another sort of big experience in my life when I was in my early 20s. I was in Boston, and I went to a Marx Brothers double feature. The Marx Brothers had sort of been forgotten, and there was a revival, and they had Night at the Opera and Duck Soup at a movie theater, and the theater was packed because the Marx Brothers were new to everyone. Almost everyone in the audience was like 20, 25 years old. And the roars of laughter just blew me away. You couldn't hear the dialogue. People were laughing so much, and I thought, I would like to make that happen.
Wow. Okay, so and is that sort of where you went as a young man? You were a comedy writer?
Well, I went through a bit of an evolution. After college, I started performing in college, and I was sort of a funny folk singer. Another of my idols is Tom Lehrer, who's the premier satirical songwriter in America in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Anyway, so I did funny songs, and then I put down the guitar, and I became a stand-up for a few years, and I did that in Boston and a little bit in New York. And I wrote some things on the side and got them to someone who could help, and I ended up writing for Mork and Mindy. That was my first professional showbiz experience.
That's wonderful. And was that, did you feel sort of like you were coming home, that was where you belonged when you finally became, did you feel as comfortable when you were singing comedy and when you were doing comedy as when you settled in as a comedy writer?
Everything I ended up changing into, I was with the greatest of agony. It was like, oh my God, no, I love my stand-up act, I'll never leave it. And then I left it, and it was, oh, I love writing, I'll never leave it, and the screenwriting. And then I sort of left that, and now I'm doing books, and I'll never leave that. This time I know it's true.
But you were a performer that you didn't, maybe past the initial angst, you didn't feel sort of ripped off that you were writing instead of, you weren't on Mork and Mindy.
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, I was never comfortable on stage. I did fairly well. I played some big gigs and got some good money, but I never was happy on stage. I never sucked it in. Look, I worked with Robin Williams, and that guy lived to make people laugh and applaud. And I always felt those loud barking noises were disruptive to my train of thought. I didn't want people laughing so loud or applauding. I wanted them to nod appreciatively. And I think writing turned out to be a much better venue for that.
Right. Although I'm sure there are those that did more than nod appreciatively for Mork and Mindy, but they weren't bothering you.
Yeah,
exactly. Because by then it was done.
They were at home. But although we shot it live, and they were barking loudly while I was there.
It's funny because I find that from being involved with musicians for so many years, I booked music for 20 years, and I find that sometimes musicians, the misnomer that all musicians want people to yell and scream for them. Some really would prefer to play a listening room where everybody's being perfectly quiet. They really don't like the clapping and the laughing and the bar
best gigs
carousing.
I played were jazz clubs, because you tended to get a very intelligent crowd who were listening and listening hard. And in comedy clubs, you sort of had to compete with drinking and dates.
And people ordering drinks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. Very, very true. So, so you worked as a writer mostly in television?
Yeah, Mork and Mindy, and then I did a little work on the movie The Muppets Take Manhattan. I did a very short stint on Saturday Night Live. I wrote for a remembered in certain circles a series called Police Squad, from which the Naked Gun movies came. Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
And then a few other shows, most of which people won't know. One that I love is Duckman. It was the adult animated series we felt we were as outrageous as South Park years before South Park. And Jason Alexander was the voice of Duckman. It was great working with him, and we got Emmy nominations. We were on for 4 years, so that was tremendously, and much more than any other writing job I've ever had. The lead character was a tremendously offensive, horrible person, or duck in this case, and you could write for him in ways you couldn't write for actual people.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Now, that was actually on regular cable?
Yeah, it was on USA.
So at the time, were you sort of fighting against what you could and couldn't do on television? I mean, South Park still fights against that, and it's then this many years later, but controversial animated shows have often sort of been kind of paving the way for shows after them by sort of, taking it in the chin with what, you can't talk about that, or that's too controversial.
Yeah, we didn't have that many fights. USA was very supportive, and I think the censor just gave up right away. I mean, we couldn't say, actual dirty words, but short of that, we got away with just some horrible things. It was really, really disgusting. Interestingly, though, on Mork and Mindy in 1979, it was 78, the first season. I wrote an episode where the act break, the point halfway through the show where you go to commercial and you have to have something really interesting so the audience will want to come back. The act break was a woman announcing to Mork and Mindy that Mork had made her pregnant. And we were told by the censor we couldn't say the word pregnant. So she had to say, I'm having a baby. This is in 1979. Now, many people know that in the early 50s, Lucille Ball got pregnant and on the show could not make any reference to being pregnant. Again, it had to be having a baby. But 1979 blew our minds. But censorship lasts a long time.
Well, but isn't the 70s was an interesting decade, right? And I talk about this on the show all the time, that on television it really was an extension of the 50s. But in real life it was,
I think that's
Studio 54 and key parties and people drugging and drinking. But on television we were still trying to so desperately maintain that everything was so wholesome.
It's sort of an interesting dynamic tension within the Mork and Mindy show itself, because the show was about a alien who knew nothing about Earth and had to learn everything, i.e., he had to be naive. So Robin Williams was playing naive. He did it great. But Robin Williams is not naive.
Sure. Right.
He knows a lot of things, and he is not an innocent by any means. In a sense, he is, in that he has a very childlike personality and creative imagination, but he's dirty as hell. And
right. And his stand-up is dirty as hell.
Dirty as hell.
Right.
So he, I feel, got a little tired of playing that. So he wanted to bring more, not literally, but more of the Studio 54 like, the actual contemporary feeling into the show. And the show was, to some degree a children's show, and it was about an innocent creature, and if you brought too much of that into it, you would destroy it. And
right.
That tension, I think, ended up hurting the show.
Right. It's interesting. Now, but not to belabor the point, pun intended, but what is the difference in having a baby and pregnant? Doesn't it all mean the same thing?
It's you have to put your mind into this, in the minds of previous generations. I believe there was a time, perhaps listeners can tell us, there was a time when the word pregnant was considered, out there. It was considered like not a nice word to say. I guess it has sexual connotations, but of course having a baby, there's nothing sexual about that. Babies are cute.
Right. Oh, okay.
And there's storks. And,
okay.
And
so if you're having a baby, then people picture the stork and the nursery that you've painted and the little mobile with duckies that goes around.
But pregnant
if you say
means,
pregnant, that means
it's obviously
the backseat of a car.
Yes, right.
That's hysterical. That's fantastic. So then how did you move from writing for television and films into writing a book?
I got older. At a certain point in TV and movies, they seem to have some problem with someone who's 2 or 3 times older than them dealing with things. The ageism is a subtle thing. It isn't a straightforward, oh, you're old, we won't hire you. But there are some legitimate reasons, too, why it's more difficult as you get older. Anyway, the writing was on the wall, and I decided to put the writing into my computer and put it in prose form rather than dialogue.
Like with anything else, was it something you fought in the beginning?
Absolutely. I fought tooth and nail, and in fact, I still have my hand in. I'm doing a pilot right now for a production company, but the odds of excelling are slim. And I'm now moving into teaching. I taught in fact, this book, the book comes out of a course I taught at USC on comedy. As far as I know, it's the first course in the world an academic course on comedy. It's not about screenwriting. It's not about TV or movies. It's about comedy as an art form, and that's what the book's about. And it comes from all the different classes about the philosophy, the history, the anthropology, the mythology, the psychology, even the theology of humor. And
wonderful.
I also deal with the Marx Brothers and Woody Allen and Lenny Bruce and all the greats.
Now, did you start? I mean, obviously you've been sort of studying that your whole life, David.
I have.
But did you start really compiling the information when you started teaching this class?
Yeah. Oh, I did a tremendous amount.
So you
of
got the
research.
class first,
Yeah.
and then started really doing the work for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I knew a lot, but I didn't know enough to actually teach a course on it or write a book on it, and then I did.
And had you taught a course before?
No, first time.
Wow.
It was great fun. I also taught a course on musical satire at UCLA, so I got to bring in Tom Lehrer, who I mentioned before, but Randy Newman and all sorts of interesting musical things that people had not really, as far as I know, no one's ever had a course on musical satire before either.
That's fantastic. So, how far back did you go with comedy? How far?
To the beginning. I go back to, as I say, comedy was almost certainly invented by a Neanderthal who tripped over a log to amuse his cave mates and then fell into the fire and burned to death, thereby inventing irony as well.
Right.
So I start from the beginning.
And tragedy.
Yeah, well, actually, in all seriousness and in all funniness, comedy and tragedy are very closely related, and the most powerful microscope in the world cannot actually determine why something is funny rather than sad. And frequently, sad things are funny and funny things are sad. You were talking about 9/11 before, and this is off this, so let's get back to it later, but there's actually a relationship between humor and actual tragedy, real life tragedy. But getting back to where it comes from, there's a mythological character called Trickster, which is a word invented by anthropologists and historians to describe a character that appears in every single human culture, which is a character who likes tricking people, who likes fooling people, who likes messing around, upending social norms, and causing chaos in any way possible, frequently with wordplay, double entendres, malapropisms, puns, and things like that. And that character is universal. Carl Jung mentions him. He's in everything, and it's almost, sadly, girls, it's almost always a he. I found like 2 female tricksters, but that's life. But the interesting thing is that Trickster was part of ceremonial rituals, frequently connected with religion. And the question is why? How does comedy have a relationship with that? And the book explores why there actually is something to do with it. It sort of gets back to the concept of surprise. And in the book I say that peekaboo is everyone's first comedy routine. Surprise is sort of the key to all art, in fact. If something's expected, it's boring.
Right. Well, and also, tricking people is part of numerous plots for movies, plots for television shows, plots for comedy on stage. That's just the idea of, you're setting the audience up and they think it's going to go here, and then it goes there. Or you're watching a story where 2 characters, one is tricking the other one to be funny. I mean, that's just what human beings naturally do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book I talk, and this is not my own definition entirely, I massaged a number of smarter people, but that all comedy can be boiled down to the phrase, a rapid juxtaposition of differing concepts. That is, 2 things that don't seem to go together are brought together in a surprising way. One example I use is Jim Carrey emerging from a mechanical rhinoceros's butt in Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls. So just that juxtaposition of 2 things that don't go together, a human being coming out of a rhinoceros's backside, is inherently funny. And yet, why? Why is it funny? Why isn't it horrifying? Why isn't it sad? I mean,
well, it kind of is funny and horrifying.
Yes, that's true.
And like you said, those often go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Just as, if we were watching the Neanderthal tripping over the log to amuse his friends and then falling into the fire, probably people instantly first would laugh that he fell into the fire before they realized how serious that was and tried to get him out.
There are 2 people who speak eloquently to that. One is Mel Brooks. The other is Charlie Chaplin. So Mel Brooks said, he's talking about the difference between comedy and tragedy, and he said, comedy is when you fall into an open manhole and die. Tragedy is when I prick my finger. So if it happens to you, it's hilarious. If it happens to me, it's horrible.
Well, I think sometimes we laugh and we don't mean to laugh.
Yes.
We laugh and then we think, oh, God, we just laughed at that. You see that in the movies all the time, and I think that you also see that, in very scary movies or very suspenseful thrillers, oftentimes laughs are set up in there
They
to
relieve
sort
tension.
of relieve the tension,
Yeah.
especially for people that are sitting in a theater.
Yeah.
You can tell that's where the in-studio laugh is supposed to go there.
Yeah, Sigmund Freud has a theory of laughter called the relief theory, which is just that laughter is to relieve us of tension. And Plato and Aristotle address your point about how we laugh at things that seem inappropriate. They actually thought laughter was indicative of a poor moral character. They said that if you laugh, it indicates you don't have sufficient feeling for other human beings.
Wow.
And they were against it. Aristotle mellowed a bit, but Plato was dead set for all his time. And the other thing I was going to bring up was Charlie Chaplin, who said life is a tragedy, is a comedy in long shot and a tragedy in close-up. And one example of that is my idol, Buster Keaton. And in all his movies where he does these amazing stunts, they're almost always shot from a long way away. And you see his amazing body doing these impossible things, and you laugh. But if you were close up, you would see that the impact. You would see his fragile flesh being punctured, being bruised, and it wouldn't be funny at all. It's only when we step far back and look at it from a distance with some perspective that it's funny.
Right. Well, like cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a character who is not real, and then you have him go through, like, say, what the coyote goes through.
Mm-hmm.
Anvil on the head, blown up, sits on the grenade. We laugh at that over and over again because we can say, well, that's just a cartoon, it's not real.
Yeah,
if you were actually watching a person go through that, it would be horrifying, but at the same time, there's something in us that we like to see that, because we sure do like to see the coyote get it again and again.
And in fact, look at The Hangover. I mean, that's sort of a live-action Roadrunner movie.
Yeah,
These guys
exactly.
go through a lot of punishment, and they express the pain, and yet we find it funny.
Right.
And a few years ago, the Home Alone movies consisted of nothing but a little kid causing horrible physical injury to two bad guys, and that gave us leave to laugh. And yet the question is, why do we laugh at the body being horribly mangled and hurt? And I got a theory for that too, which is that all comedy ultimately comes down to our fear of death, and that the human body being frail, always failing us in every conceivable way, ultimately failing us by just going away entirely. That is the ultimate tragedy of life, and the only way to deal with it is to laugh at it.
Right. Well, and I think that also, with an example like The Hangover or like The Coyote, which, as you're right, they're very similar, you see the characters sort of go through what you fear might happen.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What if I went to Vegas and did too many shots?
Yeah.
And I woke up next to a tiger and my tooth was missing and I don't know whose baby this is. I mean, it's almost
that
like
happened to me just once.
It was scary enough the first time. But The Hangover and the second Hangover, it's almost like a bad dream, where you have a really weird dream and you keep going, it can't get any worse, and then it does. And I think that we fear that as people all the time. We're scared of what might happen if we go on the cruise, what could happen to us in Vegas, what could happen to us on the roller coaster. And so we like to watch things where those things happen.
Yeah, and again, I find myself saying this constantly, it's true in comedy, but it's true in drama as well. What we're watching on the screen is sort of letting us safely live out things that could happen to us.
Right.
And we are not in danger. The characters on the screen are in danger, and usually the heroes emerge unscathed. So it's sort of like a fairy tale for a kid. It's a way of getting out the worst and knowing you're safe the whole time.
Right.
By the way,
I agree.
One thing, just getting back to the 9/11 thing, how humor is not only something that's useful in tragic circumstances, it's essentially essential.
Yes.
Right after the Challenger explosion, which was 1984 or something like that?
Sure.
It happened. And within a half hour, I got 2 separate phone calls from people saying, you know what NASA stands for? Need another 7 astronauts. Now, this was within a half hour, and I'm not such a special person. I can only assume this was happening all over the country.
Absolutely.
People were making jokes. How could you do that? How insensitive, how cruel, how necessary.
Right.
A reporter I know told me that he heard that joke within an hour or so of the Challenger explosion, and it was incredibly helpful to him because when he laughed, he got that distance that allowed him to do his job, meaning he could concentrate on his work, he could go forward, which is what we all ultimately have to do.
Right.
And that laughter after tragedy is what helps us put it in perspective and recognize it's part of life and we have to go on.
It's wonderful, and it's important. Well, I think that I'm a little scared about the character of Aristotle, and especially Plato, who did not take it back, because I think that laughter is one of our biggest self-healing mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we laugh our way through things. And what Chaplin said about comedy is something from a distance and tragedy close up.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that can also be taken in a non-literal way, that when something is actually happening that day to us, it can seem tragic.
Oh,
but
yeah.
A year later we look back on it and it's funny.
Someday we'll look back on this and laugh. There's a quote from the playwright Sarah Rule in the book, who says that lightness and levity is not like some thing to be dismissed lightly. It's a very serious way of dealing with life and needs to be respected. And that's the whole point of my book, is that comedy has always been this poor stepsister to tragedy. Tragedy
Right.
gets all the respect, it gets all the awards, but comedy requires just as much work, just as much professionalism, is just as challenging to its audience. It's just that laughter in itself seems easy and fun, and therefore I think comedy doesn't get the respect that drama does.
Right. And sometimes it's even harder, because you're
Yeah,
playing out the same
absolutely.
serious situation, but you're having to do it with...
One interesting thing is that all through movie history, you find comedic actors doing drama really effectively. It's much rarer to see a drama actor do comedy well. Robert De Niro is one who springs to mind, but most dramatic actors, when they do comedy, feel the need to go broad, that they have to make sure people know where the laugh is. But comedians have faith in the material and faith in themselves, and they don't usually have to push things to get their reactions.
Right. It's awesome. Can't wait to hear more about the book. We have to take a quick break, then we're right back with you with more of the wonderful David Misch right after this, and where he's going to be appearing. His book is Funny the Book, everything you always wanted to know about comedy. It's the Sheena Metal Experience on LA Talk Radio. Quick break, and we're right back with you with much more radio fun. It's the Sheena Metal Experience right here on LA Talk Radio. For more info on the show, latalkradio.com, SheenaMetalExperience.com. Don't forget to email me and let me know what you think of the show. Wonderful author David Misch is here with me all this hour, and his book is Funny the Book, everything you always wanted to know about comedy. David, how in the world do you take the history of comedy and then put it into one book? Because it sounds like it could be an encyclopedia of volumes of book.
It does. Everything you always wanted to know about comedy is perhaps a bit hyperbolic.
Volume 1.
Yeah, volume 1 of 100. I leave out so much it's just obscene. But I try to hop around and give everyone a little bit about a lot of things rather than too much about any one thing. But, you just pick and choose what you think the most interesting things are. By the way, I always forget, so let me try and not forget and just mention that the book has a website, funnythebook.com, and the cool thing is that you can avoid spending $13 entire to buy the book and go to the website for free and see lots of comedy clips that are mentioned in the book and references to other comedy things. So there's actually lots of fun information there, and you can just rip me off and go there for free. I will hunt
Maybe
you down.
Maybe that's not the best sales pitch.
Maybe not, but yeah. I will hunt you down like a dog.
I think you should go and buy the book and then go get all the extras for free.
I actually prefer that way.
At funnythebook.com.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So what was it like? I mean, because even just earlier when you were talking about examples from movies and you were quoting, Aristotle and Plato and Mel Brooks, and just the footnoting alone for the quotes. I mean, to do something that has this much history, but that also is, for all intents and purposes, completely nonfiction. So you had to quote people, you had to check things and reference things. I mean, that alone could have taken 15 years.
It took 2 or 3. The fun thing, one of my favorite comedy things is Monty Python, and what they love is going from Schopenhauer jokes to people wrestling and people dressed like women and wrestling in mud. And this book quotes Aristotle, and it also has a whole section on fart jokes. So it's got everything you want. It's not too intellectual, and it tries to cover all possible bases.
But it's nice. Monty Python's a great example of a kind of humor that is sort of multi-level, so that
exactly.
you can go and multi-layered, so that you can go and you can look at what slapstick thing is happening with them and laugh, or you can, and as with much British humor, you can start paying attention and really get what they're doing. And then once you do, you get the historical references, you get the satire, you get the irony, you get all the different things that they're doing. But you can just pick up what you can pick up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how comedy can work on many different levels. So I was on Saturday Night Live very briefly, and they had a bulletin board there, and they had a clipping on the bulletin board which was a very small item from the New York Times. It said a survey showed that the majority of Saturday Night Live's audience at that point, it was the mid-'80s, was 13 to 15-year-olds. And the thing that blew everyone's mind was, first of all, who knew they could stay up till 1 in the morning?
Right.
But also, it wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at hip people in their 20s and 30s.
Right.
And yet it was being watched by these kids who almost certainly couldn't understand many, if not most,
Although
of the references.
I did. I was 11.
Yeah,
and I would literally make myself stay up until 1 o'clock.
Right.
And a lot of times my mom would try to stay up, and at about midnight she'd be like, honey, you can stay up. But that was my special thing. I could stay up as late as I wanted on Saturday, so I could watch it.
Yeah.
And I would learn what the references were. If I didn't get them, then I would teach myself, or I would ask my mom, what is this and what's that about? And
that's what everyone came to the conclusion, is that it's aspirational, that young kids would watch it, even because it was so cool to be in that world, to be in that glamorous adult world, and to hear these hip things going on, even if you didn't know what they were, you figured it out.
Right. And don't you think that's what kids also did with The Simpsons? It's what they now do with South Park?
Well, Simpsons and South Park, especially Simpsons, because South Park is really aimed more at an older audience, I think. But Simpsons works, for, as they say, 5-year-olds to 70-year-olds. It's got something for everyone, and that's, I think, what the best comedy does, like Python.
Right. Well, I think that Python was aimed at an older audience.
Yeah,
and I think that South Park is, but I think Saturday Night Live was as well.
Yeah,
that's why they put it on in the middle of the night.
Yeah, absolutely.
But kids loved it.
Kids would be watching it.
Right. Well, kids will watch everything.
Absolutely.
That's the thing, is that you can't keep anything from kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my mom sitting me right down in front of the PBS to watch Monty Python, and it was on late at night too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're talking the 70s when everything was controversial.
Yeah.
Now I think with the internet, kids find everything.
It's true.
But I think it's good for kids to sort of develop their funny chops and learn to understand the importance of comedy.
Well, what's best for kids, I think, is to explore all sorts of things, broaden their minds, and get agitated and intrigued by wildly different things, and comedy's part of that. But, safe comedy, well, in a way, almost safe comedy doesn't exist. Any comedy that's going to be successful has to be a little edgy.
Right.
That's in the nature of the beast. Again, the trickster is always trying to surprise people and outrage people, and that's what comedy generally does.
Now, how do you feel about social networking? Because I think that social networking has become an amazing way for people to pass humor around to thousands and thousands of people at one time, whether it's little funny images that have a funny caption, or it's a joke somebody heard today, or it's something somebody saw and then made a joke about. In the beginning of the hour today, I was speaking on the phone with my publicist on the air, and he was talking about, people now come up with funny things to hashtag them on Twitter, and he was talking about people, naming Mitt Romney Money Boo Boo. And now people see things, and then they take one pop culture reference and they mash another one, and then the next thing you know, it's trending and everybody in the world has seen it. I mean, to me, I love it because I think it's strengthening our sense of humor as human beings.
Yeah, I think initially I and many other people in the professional comedy world were outraged. How dare people try and do this on their own? They're not qualified.
Right.
But I think now it's obvious that it's good for everyone. It broadens the field for comedy, and obviously comedy is not suffering. Professional comedy is not suffering.
No, not at all.
There are a number of interesting repercussions. So Weird Al Yankovic was at my class at UCLA on musical satire. He's like the nicest person in the world. I called him up and I said, I got his email, and I emailed and said, would you come to my class at UCLA on musical satire? He wrote back, yes. And I said, it's a seminar. It's 15 kids, and you play stadiums of 100,000 people. So this would be 15, not 100,000. He said, yes. And then
awesome.
he drives in and he walks in by himself and he sits and he talks to us for an hour. So it could have been nicer. But anyway, he said an interesting thing, which was, I said, what about the internet? How about a song like Friday comes along and there are 100 parodies of it within 24 hours,
right,
and that they're taking your job? And he said, yes, it's definitely a problem, and I definitely have to choose my targets carefully. But he said, in all modesty, he said, I hope that the quality of my work is going to be superior to those things that come out in the first 24 hours, and people will think Yankovic usually does top drawer stuff, and they'll still buy my stuff.
Right, and I think that for artists like him, and he's a great example, that have never been somebody who, for maybe a brief period of time in the 80s, but mostly he never got a lot of mainstream radio play.
Mm-hmm.
The internet has helped to cultivate his fan base. I
Yeah,
mean, he's always had an
so.
enormous underground fan base.
You know, he had that big thing with Lady Gaga last year. In fact, he came to my class just when that was happening, and he said the internet had a huge effect on that all her fans wrote her and said, don't do this, because he wanted to do a parody of Born This Way.
Right.
And she initially, he heard through her manager that she wouldn't allow it. She claimed she had never been directly asked, but in any case, the result was she ended up giving him her blessing, and he feels it was largely due to the pressure from the millions of fans online.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, and that's just more ways that comedy spreads.
Yeah.
And more people are learning about comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Is it amazing to you that when people get your book, or even when you teach a class, that more people don't know about sort of the history of comedy and some of the comedy greats?
You know, I went in with low expectations. I was told by some people at USC that, these kids really don't remember past, American Pie. They've heard of The Godfather, but they won't have seen it. And I didn't find that to be the case. When I mentioned Buster Keaton, a good number of kids knew him, and everyone was open to him. Black and white is often a big turnoff for people, and, no dialogue is a turnoff for people. But
sure.
They were totally open to it, and they got it, and they loved it. And I felt very vindicated by that. I think that this generation, from my limited experience, seems to be open to trying things like that maybe other generations weren't. But as far as their literacy, a lot of people don't know the history of comedy, and that's one reason I did this, although the book is not just history. But, it's got a fascinating history, and it's got a funny history. There's a joke in the book, which is a guy reads Hamlet, and a friend says, how'd you like it? And he says, it's nothing but a bunch of quotations. And when you know the history of comedy, every movie and TV show you see is just quotations of things that have been done years before.
That's fantastic. But that's true about isn't that it's true that people that are just being exposed to Shakespeare already know so much of Shakespeare.
Exactly.
And I felt that way when I was a kid and I discovered Shakespeare. As I was reading through the plays, I thought, that's where that comes from, and that's where that comes from.
Buster Keaton's most famous stunt was he's standing in front of the facade of a house with a small window at the top, and there's a hurricane, and the facade collapses and falls on him, but he safely passes through this small opening of the window. It was an incredibly dangerous stunt. In fact, the director refused to shoot it. He left the set. He didn't want to be responsible for shooting Buster Keaton's death, but he didn't die. It was a 2-ton facade that fell. In any case, that has now been repeated in the class I show them. In fact, on the website, funnythebook.com, you can see all the different variants. The Simpsons did one, Weird Al did one, Jackie Chan did one in a martial arts movie. The Jackass guy, what's his name? I'm suddenly spacing on. Johnny Knoxville.
Right.
He did one. So this is like this iconic moment that just keeps getting repeated, except that many of the people who watched Johnny Knoxville had no idea that Buster Keaton was behind it.
Wow. Now, why Buster Keaton for you? Why is he your favorite?
Chaplin is the one who's generally considered the greatest. Actually, Groucho Marx is considered the greatest comedian of all time, but Chaplin's probably the most famous and beloved. And the reason I prefer Keaton is that he never asks you to care. Chaplin makes it clear that he's this sad tramp who we want to root for to win. Chaplin never breaks he was called the Great Stoneface. He never breaks that character. He never asks for your pity. He never asks for you to care, and yet you end up caring tremendously. You sort of project your own feelings onto him, and I find that a subtler and more powerful way of getting the audience involved. And then he, just as a human specimen, just this unbelievable, he did all his own stunts, some of which were incredibly dangerous. He broke his neck on one and had bones. Jackie Chan credits him as his major influence. And to do all these things for real without CGI or stuntmen or something,
Absolutely.
It just blows your mind.
Wow. Yeah.
There's also, I think, without getting wildly pretentious, although I don't mind doing that, a metaphysical aspect to Keaton, because he gets into all these horrible situations, and instead of fighting them, he goes with them. Instead of flailing about, he sort of sees how fate will take him. And he was a completely unphilosophical person, unintellectual person, so he would never have said he was doing it on purpose. But clearly that's how he got through life, was sort of going with the way things are doing instead of fighting them and trying to change them, allowing yourself to blend in with them. And he did this literally in many of his movies. He will literally become a machine. He, like Chaplin became a machine in modern times, he gets caught in the cogs of this huge machine. And Keaton at one point becomes he becomes like a balloon. He becomes at one with a car, with a train, and it's that sort of thing. I think it's obviously Keaton was a major star and ordinary people loved him, but if you look at him from a deeper level, there's a lot there too.
Wow. And you don't think that he as a person was aware of any of that going into it?
He was asked about the meaning of one of his movies, and he said, "I'm not qualified to speak about my work." So
wow.
he never gave any thought to that. He was just a working vaudeville comic.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Well, and it was interesting when you were talking about tragedy. Speaking of vaudeville, I was thinking about, you were talking about how in the last hour I was speaking a bit about 9/11, and it was in vaudevillian times people would survive a tragedy and they would make a vaudeville show out of it, and there would be humor in the show. Titanic survivors, people that survived, plane crashes, fires, Hindenburg, whatever it was, would suddenly be touring vaudeville in a show, and it would become variety.
Yeah, it's Steve Allen, a famous comic of the 50s, said comedy equals the formula was comedy equals tragedy plus time.
Right.
So the moment it happens, it obviously isn't funny, but later it is, and that way of that looking at it with perspective is a key way we have of processing things so that we can keep on living.
Right, and not go crazy.
Yeah.
Or die of depression.
Exactly.
Now, are you thinking about doing another one?
Yeah, I have an idea for a book about comedy movies and stuff like that. But my hands are full at the moment promoting Funny the Book, and I'm traveling around with a thing called the Jewish Book Council. They book you into Jewish book clubs around the country.
So wonderful.
I'm now going to be seeing Jews from many states. I'm going to Montgomery, Alabama, which I didn't realize had such a sizable Jewish population.
Right. You thought that was an oxymoron.
Yeah.
The Alabama Jews.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. Now,
fun.
and then here you're doing the West Hollywood book signing.
Yes, I'm
Book Fair.
West Hollywood Book Fair on September 30th. I'm on a panel called Funny with Rachel Dratch, and I think I'm going to forget the other people's names. I think Judy Tenuta is on that.
She's amazing.
Yeah. And she was actually a character on Duckman. And then next week, no, it's not next week, 2 weeks, September 23rd, I'll be at the California Women's Conference moderating a panel with Jerry Jewell of Facts of Life and Judy Carter, who's a well-known motivational speaker and former stand-up comic. And just one other thing, November 1st, I'm going to be talking at the Santa Monica Public Library about not just the history, but the anthropology of laughter, the history of humor and the anthropology of laughter, because laughter actually just divorced from humor, because, of course, we laugh frequently when there's nothing funny going on. And the way that developed is quite interesting, I think.
Now, do you love this, having been a kid that sat up late at night and read all the comedy you could get your hands on, to be able to go out and speak about comedy? Is that the most fun in the world for you?
It is, and I get to show these clips, many of which people don't know. And, you'd think the Marx Brothers everyone would know, and boy, do they not. I show the most famous Marx Brothers scene, the stateroom scene, where they're all crammed into this tiny room. And I can tell from the laughter that, two-thirds of the audience has never seen it before. So that's such a thrill to be able to show these people who I love to other people. I had a daughter growing up, and I got to impose all of my favorite things on her, and now I get to impose them on other people, too.
Well, and my mom did that as well with me, even with now finding out things she didn't even like. But she still sat me down in front of everything.
That's great.
So that I saw a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
But I think not all parents must do that.
I don't know if they do. I was pretty tough that way with my daughter too. I really wanted her to be exposed to every conceivable thing. So I don't think everyone does that. I think a great parent does that.
Yeah, I do too. And when did you write for Saturday Night Live?
It was the 84-85 season, which was, as I say,
that was a good time.
Well, it was right between. It was Lorne Michaels was not there. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name.
Oh
He's
wow,
really famous.
okay.
It was the interregnum. He had quit and then he came back the year after. But it was a year with Billy Crystal, Michael McKean, and Harry Shearer.
It's fantastic.
So that was very, very exciting. And the first show I did, Jesse Jackson was a guest host, and he had just made a fairly anti-Semitic remark. And so there were pickets in front of the studio and the very charged atmosphere, so it was really exciting.
And you knew you weren't on Mork and Mindy anymore.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Will you come back and see me again, David?
I am
I'd love
happy
that.
to, yes.
And where can people find out about you and the book online?
funnythebook.com has loads of information, far more than you'll ever need about me, and as much as you need about the book. A lot of fun things, links to things about vaudeville and ancient Greek theater and stuff like that.
Awesome.
And lots of videos, comedy clips, and TV shows.
It's wonderful. And if you missed any of the links for David Misch, you can also go to SheenaMetalExperience.com or LATalkRadio.com. Send me an email, and I'll gladly forward those links over to you.